The 1960s was a decade of radical change in society, and often marked by violence and confrontation, as societal norms were being challenged, and marginalized voices clamored to be heard. Reflecting this change was a revolution in art, fashion, literature, and popular culture, all of which was underscored by possibly the greatest soundtrack in the history of pop music. Artists like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, The Who, The Doors, Bob Dylan, The Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, The Beach Boys, Jefferson Airplane, and a host of others all came to prominence in the era. Additionally, there were also many successful novelty songs, and artists who became known as one-hit wonders for topping the charts with a single composition but never achieving such lofty heights again. And then there are those who toiled in the shadows, the dreamers hoping for their big break and a shot at stardom, whether performing in a garage or on a dingy stage in some small pub. Countless young people strummed on guitars or pounded on drums, each of them hoping that someday they would be discovered and take their place in the pantheon of musical greats. Many lacked the talent or the discipline or the luck to make a name for themselves in the music industry. But one such aspiring hopeful was not lacking in these areas, and yet he never managed to achieve the notoriety and acclaim of many of his contemporaries. And that man was Danny Savage. Daniel Porter Stimson was born in Hermosa Beach, California, on the 18th of August, 1945. His father, Eric, ran a radio and television repair shop, where young Daniel would often be tasked with testing the radios. That was where his love of music began, especially once he was introduced to the new rock and roll sound that was sweeping the world in the 1950s. His mother, Eunice, encouraged the boy to take piano lessons, and it was soon revealed that Danny had a natural gift for making music. Despite making good progress on the piano, Danny quickly tired of the lessons and picked up the guitar, the ukulele, and the banjo, followed by the saxophone, trumpet, and clarinet. He played trumpet in the high school marching band, but soon switched to the sousaphone before dropping out of the band altogether. His father criticized the boy for lacking the patience and discipline to stick with one thing and perfect it, but his mother took a more generous attitude, believing that her son was just inquisitive and eager to learn new things. In today's world, Danny would likely have been diagnosed with ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, as he displayed many of the classic symptoms, such as being easily distracted, displaying excessive restlessness, and impulsive behavior. But in the 1960s, a child displaying these symptoms was often dismissed as an annoying oddball, a phrase Danny heard many times in his young life. Growing up in a beachfront community, Danny briefly tried his hand at surfing, but found that he was happier glorifying the sport in song than actually participating in it, and joined his first band, the Slammers, while still a teenager. Danny's versatility was quite handy, as he could cover for any of the other band members who failed to show up, something that was a regular occurrence. The band primarily played covers of popular surf artists of the day, such as Dick Dale, Jan and Dean, and of course, the Beach Boys, although Danny wrote a few original compositions for the group as well. The Slammers proved to be a somewhat popular local attraction, and Danny dreamed of one day hearing one of his own songs on the radio, as he had listened to so many others in his father's employ. Unfortunately, the leader of the band, Gerald Hurley, was attacked by a shark and severely injured, causing the group to lose focus and eventually drift apart. Danny was not the organizing type and shifted from one group to another, even briefly joining a mariachi band, before joining a combo with the tragically ironic name, the Silver Sharks. Fortunately, this band was not intrinsically tied to beach culture, and the odds of losing two musicians to shark attacks seemed quite slim. Danny was beginning to emerge as a versatile composer, but unfortunately he had the ironic trait of writing songs with titles that would become popular later by other artists, such as Surf City, Be My Baby, Light My Fire, and Fiesta en Jalisco, the title of a popular mariachi tune that would be released in 1970. Although his songs bore little to no resemblance with the more famous releases, it was always assumed that Danny was simply copying from other artists, which caused him for a time to give his songs mundane titles, like Tuesday, In the Shower, and That Time We Stole a Carton of Cigarettes, a ploy that worked well until he penned a song called Yesterday, which would top the charts for the Beatles a year after he composed his tune. Danny's attention difficulties began to truly manifest themselves while performing with the Silver Sharks, as he would sometimes wander off stage in the middle of a performance or forget the lyrics to one of his own songs. When he was focused, Danny was a dynamic performer, but all too often he became sidetracked and began playing a different song from the rest of the band, or chasing a spider around the floor mid-tune like a curious cat, which ultimately led to his dismissal from the Silver Sharks in 1964. Never able to focus on his schoolwork, college had seemed out of the question, and his father expected him to help out more at the shop. But Danny showed no aptitude for tinkering with electronics or customer service. Making music was just too much a part of his life to settle for anything less, although it would be a road filled with hardship and disappointment. Daniel occasionally referred to himself as Danny Savage when performing, which was in stark contrast to his rather sweet nature. But he had always been a fan of the Doc Savage comic book character, and adopted that for his stage name, and eventually he was going by that moniker all the time. After seeing The Byrds in a club in Los Angeles, Danny decided for a time to become a solo act, performing in the folk rock style that emerged in the mid-60s. But having no one to manage the bookings and keep the act moving forward, he found it increasingly difficult to get gigs, as he frequently failed to show up or walked off in mid-performance. In part because of his name, he was presumed to be moody and temperamental, but in reality, he simply was frequently distracted. While Danny definitely demonstrated a gift for melodic composition, his lyrics often left something to be desired, as they reflected his scattered nature. For example, his song, A Walk in the Woods, began as a simple ode to nature, but then drifted into a commentary about which cigarette ads he particularly enjoyed, then veered briefly into a semi-pornographic description of a girl he had known in high school, before descending into a fairly indecipherable stream of consciousness. While some assumed he was merely avant-garde and challenging the traditional artistic forms, most people were left simply confused. It was at this point that a woman named Susan Cadbury appeared on the scene and helped bring structure to both his lyrics and his life in general. Susan served as his muse, his manager, and his collaborator, as well as his lover. It was the most organized period of young Danny's life, but it ended all too quickly when Susan ran off with a member of the Lovin' Spoonful. Danny was devastated by the heartbreak and impulsively got on a bus to Beaumont, Texas, where he found work briefly on an oil rig. But like so many other ventures, his inattention to detail resulted in an unfortunate incident which terminated his employment. For a time, Danny abandoned his rock and roll roots and attempted to style himself as a country and western performer, and his usual difficulties prevented him from enjoying much success in that field. His stay in Texas came to an abrupt end when one night he performed a number that seemed to be basically an anti-capitalist rant, which offended a number of the bar patrons who made a point of letting him know that his kind wasn't welcome in those parts. After drifting for a time, Danny found himself in San Francisco and immediately felt at home in the counterculture community, not so much out of political affiliation, but because it was a place where being an oddball was just doing your own thing. Danny was befriended almost immediately by a group of young artists, poets, and musicians who lived together in an old Victorian house and who seemed to embrace his quirky personality as well as his musical skills. It was in this newfound circle of friends that he was introduced to the drug culture for the first time. It would mark a major turning point in his life, both personally and professionally, although introducing mind-altering chemicals to his already imbalanced brain was a potentially risky proposition. In San Francisco, Danny found a sense of community, and he became a fixture of the music scene, as a new sound was emerging, one that reflected an openness to new ideas and sensations. For Danny, who had been jilted by the one true love of his life, the more communal and permissive sexual freedom he found was a welcome relief. The expression sex, drugs, and rock and roll might perfectly embody Danny's life at this time, as the world seemed to be a never-ending kaleidoscope of sensual experiences. He often sat in with more established groups and eventually formed his own band, the Psychedelic Sharks, paying a sly tribute to his surf band origins. While Danny was the primary driving force creatively, he was fortunately relieved of most of the business burdens by the group's tambourine player, who was simply known as Anastasia, although it is believed that her actual name was Judith Archer. Although she filled many of the roles that Susan Cadbury had filled, and often shared his bed, there is no indication that they ever had a serious, formal romantic relationship. She was simply one of the many women in his life who attempted to gently keep him afloat. In 1967, the world would take notice of what was happening in San Francisco, as countless young people poured into the city as the music scene exploded, and the Haight-Ashbury district seemed like the most happening place on the planet. Historians would someday refer to this period as the Summer of Love, but for Danny, the old restlessness was getting to him. Despite being surrounded by a community of people who embraced him, bedding a seemingly endless string of attractive young women, and taking his music to a higher level than it had ever gone before, no amount of booze or drugs could keep him totally anchored in one place. The Psychedelic Sharks had attracted the attention of several record labels, and had Danny stayed focused long enough to make a demonstration tape, he might well have landed a recording contract and potentially joined his local contemporaries on the top of the pop charts. But that was not to be. The only known example of his work from this period is the soundtrack to an experimental film produced by one of his roommates, Geraldine Phillips, which was discovered in an attic in 2003. on a whim, Danny packed up his few possessions and moved back to Los Angeles, although he never tried to look up his parents. Having no job, no band, and no place to live, Danny regretted his decision to leave San Francisco almost immediately, until he ran into a familiar face from the Bay Area, one Charles Manson. Manson had been a fixture in the Haight-Ashbury community and was often referred to as a guru or a shaman, seemingly always surrounded by a group of young women. The two men seemed to have a lot in common in that they were both aspiring musicians, had lived for a time in San Francisco, took copious amounts of drugs, and practiced free love as often as possible. Manson even claimed to be associated with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, a band that had greatly influenced Danny in his teenage years. Manson was living with a number of other young people in an abandoned movie location called the Spawn Ranch, and invited Danny to join them there. Having nowhere else to go and no plans, he accepted the invitation. While Manson's hippie commune bore some resemblance to the bohemian environment Danny had left behind, it soon became apparent that Manson's followers were actually a cult who would seemingly do anything for their leader. For Danny, the vibe wasn't good, and he decided to leave shortly after arriving. In light of the gruesome murders committed by Manson and his followers in 1969, it may well have been the best decision he ever made in his life. It is at this time that Danny largely disappears from the radar until the tragic event that would end his life all too soon. In August of 1969, Danny purchased a bus ticket to New York, where he hoped to attend the Woodstock Music Festival. But while waiting for the bus, he became distracted by something shiny in the street and stepped out in front of the moving vehicle that he had been waiting for to convey him to the musical extravaganza. Danny initially survived the accident, but succumbed to his injuries 3 days later. His passing seems to have gone largely unnoticed, as he had estranged himself from his family and lost touch with his friends. And although there are numerous contemporary accounts of his talent, we are left to imagine what those might have been. There is no way to know for certain what the course of Danny's life would have been like had he been diagnosed and treated for his attention disorder. Perhaps he would have flourished and found the discipline to remain focused on his career long enough to achieve some degree of stardom. Or perhaps he would simply have toiled away in his father's repair shop. Danny Savage may not have died with a wall full of gold records, but in many ways he was the embodiment of his generation, always yearning, on the move, and dreaming of something better and more beautiful.